Cool. So yeah, I'm Ann Wallace, Global Practice Lead for Google Cloud Professional Services.
And as Steven just said, I'm Mike Kaczorowski. I'm a product manager in security at Google. So what we're going to be talking about today is how to get started with container forensics when it turns out that your cluster is a cluster. We'll cover why you should care because attacks to containers are real, what forensics are, and how to prepare ahead of time, data sources that you can use for investigations for containers specifically, common mitigation options, and then finally, what you can do today. So talking about why are we even talking about container forensics? Do containers actually get attacked at all? And so when we're looking back at last year, what are the attacks that we've seen in the wild? In February 2018, Tesla made the news for attackers finding credentials that they had gained to mine cryptocurrency. In May, Shopify had a researcher report a vulnerability in their cluster configuration. Thankfully, this was not exploited. In June, Weight Watchers faced the exact same issue as Tesla with an unsecured dashboard. And the same month, several container images were found on Docker Hub that had embedded malware for mining cryptocurrency. More recently, in late April 2019, Docker Hub announced that attackers had accessed a Docker Hub database which held user data, including Docker Hub usernames, hash passwords, and GitHub and Bitbucket tokens used for auto-building Docker container images. Now, this affected more than 190,000 accounts, but an unknown number of images. And if any of the images that were affected, how many times those were pulled. And some of you might have seen this slide before and think I'm being kind of lazy at updating this, but I'm not. There actually haven't been that many attacks in the wild being reported on. We've had lots of vulnerabilities in this space, in Kubernetes and CPUs and related projects and whatnot, but no significant report of these being exploited live. An interesting thing to note about these attacks is that none of them explicitly attack containers or containerized workloads. And that's because the end goal isn't your application, right? An attacker is not going to make money by going and exploiting the application you're running on Kubernetes. They're going to make money by stealing your compute, cryptocurrency mining, creating a botnet, whatever it happens to be. So let's jump into some forensics.
Oh, I have a mic.
That was my issue.
Yeah. Cool. So yes, let's first talk about security forensics, and then we'll get into how this applies to containers. So what we really want to do here is put ourselves in the best possible position to deal with an incident. We'll spend some time today on all of these, but the takeaway for today is really on collection, and more specifically, how this pertains to containers. So you've probably listened to all of Maya's past container security presentations. You've applied security container Kubernetes security best practices to your cluster. Your cluster is about as secure as it can get, yet something or somebody still infiltrated your environment. Now what? Well, don't panic. Don't terminate all your nodes, containers, disks. This is where some of the evidence resides that we need to collect to tell the story of what happened. Now, in extreme cases, this might be necessary, but Maya will talk about this in a later section. And don't be a hero. Don't log into your server or container. There's multiple reasons you don't want to do this. One, you don't want to let the attacker know that you know what's going on. And two, it could potentially compromise your credentials. OK, so you're not panicking, but what are you going to look at? Let's start to gather some evidence. But what are you going to look at? This is, we find that the evidence lies in 3 different areas. One, your logs. 2, your disk. And 3, live and potentially historical information. So we're going to spend some time focusing on this area, and again, how it pertains to containers and Kubernetes. So logs. I doubt anyone would really question the value of logs when tracking down an event. So what we want to do here is identify several sources of meaningful logs and decide on what to do with them. You want to make sure that all your logs are going to a central location. Doing this, you're able to search for events across multiple sources. It helps guarantee that your logs haven't been tampered with, even if the host they're coming from has been. And then depending on where you're sending your logs, some of the places you could send your logs, some systems can do anomaly detection, which can help notify you of a possible event. In the next section, Maya will talk more about the different types of logs and the information you might gather from these. So traditionally in a data center, if after an event, you would have to shut down the server, remove the disk, bring that back up in some kind of quarantine environment. Luckily with cloud, we have APIs where we can take disk snapshots. Container, there is no snapshot mechanism, but we'll talk about some possible solutions in this area. The main point here is you can start doing analysis without the attacker being clued in on so they don't erase their tracks. Cool. So this is really where the magic comes in. So how do you get information from a system without logging in? How do you get information from multiple systems without logging in? How do you get information from containers that might have died? So this is what we call live and recorded information. The SRE team at Google has this motto that's, we hope for the best, but plan for the worst. I really think this applies to security, and more specifically, incident response plans. It's really easy for me to stand up here and tell you not to panic when an incident happens, but any of us that have ever been involved in an incident, you're going to panic. You feel that in the gut of your stomach. You just, But having an incident response plan in place helps you know, or the other folks know, what steps to take in case of an incident. It lets you know who to notify, your communication plan, the systems that you need to keep up and running so your business is still up and running, and then what actions to take and how to start diagnosing what happened. So cool. So, that was a quick overview of security forensics and really focusing on collections. So let's really dive into more in that area and how it applies to containers.
Sounds good. So let's look at logs first. As Anne mentioned, one of the first places to look when you're conducting forensics are logs. Many logs don't significantly change for containerized environments. For example, like network logs aren't really different as long as you can map back an IP address to a single pod rather than just the node that it's running on. So we're going to look at 4 different kinds of logs. Infrastructure logs, these are changes to your infrastructure. It's what the infra does and what a human does to the infra. If you're using a cloud provider, this includes changes to cloud APIs that you're accessing and to your services. Kubernetes logs, these are what the control plane does, what a container does to the control plane, and what a user does to the control plane. Think of this as anything that needs kube control or anything that Kubernetes handles for you. Operating system logs, these are calls to the OS on the node that the container runs on. It's about what actions your containers are taking in the node. And application logs. These are logs for what's happening inside of your application. They're actually generally the same for containerized and non-containerized apps, but how you collect them is going to be a little bit different. All of these also have the concept of audit logs. So if you're looking to figure out why something is the way that it is in your environment and who made it that way, poof, audit logs is the place to go. They're what you're going to mostly use to figure out what another human, like an attacker, did in your environment. So let's look at each of these. So first, infrastructure logs. Let's say you're running in a cloud infrastructure. These logs should include information about what underlying services you're using and what operations the user made to those resources. Typical logs that you'd expect to see here are things like error logs, quota warnings, debug information, as well as audit logs. So this here is a sample cloud audit log for creating a cluster in GKE. You'll notice it contains some information specifically about the request, like the type of operation, how it was authenticated and authorized, as well as information about the content of the request, like the version type chosen for the GKE cluster. What's going to be logged is going to be based on your cloud audit logging policy or logging policy. As logs can get expensive quickly, you probably want some minimum set of operations logged everywhere in your environment, but only much more detailed logs for higher risk areas. Example of higher risk areas where you might want more logs are going to be your PCI compliant cluster, your secret storage bucket, and your firewall rules. Next up, Kubernetes logs. If your organization has a team that manages the infrastructure for you, including Kubernetes, then you might not even have realized that these were different. If, however, you are the infrastructure team, though, then Kubernetes logs is the exact same concept as the infrastructure logs, but for Kubernetes. After all, Kubernetes is part of your infrastructure, right? So Kubernetes audit logs are actions taken in Kubernetes. A given request will generate events at multiple points in its lifecycle. First, when the request is received, then when a response is started, and finally, when a response is completed. The Kube API server will process these events, and according to your audit logging policy, will log them. So just like for your infrastructure logs, Kubernetes can log events at different depths of detail based on the information that's included. Kubernetes has 4 different audit levels that are on the left-hand side of the page here. None, which doesn't log events at all. Metadata, which logs request metadata only. This includes requesting user, timestamp, resource, and verb. This is a good choice for operations where the verb is enough to tell you what happened. The next level, request, which logs metadata plus the request body. This is a good choice for operations where you're changing configurations and you want to be able to capture what that change is. And then request response, which logs event metadata and the request body plus the request response body. If you're getting started crafting your own audit policy, you can check out the one that GK uses online. There's some excerpts here. It's in the open source repo. Basically, GET requests, because they can be very large to log, are at the request level. Known APIs are at the request response level. and any calls not explicitly covered by the policy are at the metadata level, again, meeting that kind of base level of logging that you'd expect to have everywhere. Operating system logs cover events happening inside your node operating system, right? When you remember containers have two sets of OSs, this is the one on the node that you're running your containers on top of. So this, for example, will include network connections, user logins, and SSH sessions, and certain executions like execv. When you collect these logs on Kubernetes, you do so by deploying a logging agent as a daemon set, for example, FluentD, to collect the logs, which then writes them to a logging infrastructure like Stackdriver or Elasticsearch and Kibana. FluentD has really good documentation on how to do this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But basically, you need to provide the FluentD daemon set with the log storage pod's host and port, and then give FluentD the right permissions, and it'll take care of the rest for you. To make this slightly easier for cost logs on GKE, we've actually recently published a recommended FluentD configuration and how-to get these logs. If you check out the GKE documentation, you can take a look at that. Be careful if you're going to tune any of these OS audit logs yourself, because you could end up with a lot of logs. And I mentioned earlier, logs are expensive, and storing logs is expensive. So make sure you actually know what you're capturing, or test it out first before you kind of dive all in. Note also that logs can only be generated for events occurring after the daemon set is deployed when you're using a model like this, right? So it's recommended to create the daemon set right after cluster creation. Then every time that you add new nodes to the cluster, they'll have the configuration applied automatically. And then lastly, application logs. Application logs are logs from your application that you wrote, including errors, warnings, for example, of like low memory or disk space. They actually aren't that different for containerized applications, as we mentioned earlier, but how you collect them is going to be a little bit different. Actually, how you collect them is really easy because we just talked about it. You're going to use a logging agent as a daemon set, and then write it to a logging infrastructure in the exact same way that we just talked about with OS audit logs. So it's the same concept that you can apply for your own application logs. So pulling all of that together, where do the logs come from, and where do they go in your infra? Infrastructure logs, including audit logs, come from your infrastructure, surprise, and somehow end up in your logging system. Kubernetes logs and audit logs that you collect from Kubernetes, for example, using a logging agent like FluentD. If you're using a managed Kubernetes service, this is usually ingested for you. OS logs, including audit logs, and application logs, you can collect yourself using your own logging agent. Now, recall, if you're running a logging agent yourself, you're going to probably want to send them to a logging infrastructure, like I mentioned. And what Anne said at the beginning of the talk is you probably want to get all of your logs in one single place. That makes it easier for you to filter over all the possible events that occurred in your infrastructure, and also to be able to pivot on any particular resource and see what actually happened to that thing. That also means that you need to be really careful about having consistent identifiers for the same resource, so that when you try to do that pivot, you're not kind of losing information and having to jumble stuff together afterwards, right? Cleaning data is really annoying. Lastly, you'll want to set up a backup for these logs, or some subset of them, likely based on your own retention requirements.
Cool. So this is an example. In this example, we're using API to create a disk snapshot, and then of the affected node, and sending a copy over to an isolated location. So this isolated location, if you're in AWS, could be a different AWS account, GCP, maybe a different GCP project, or it could just be an isolated network, locked down VPC. And then you can start doing analysis of it. But the thing here is, once you bring this disk image up on a different node, your containers are no longer running, so it's really hard to tell what was going on at the time the snapshot was taken when the containers were running. So at Google, we have an open source project called Docker Explorer, which is helps you do forensic analysis of offline Docker file systems from a disk snapshot. So for example, if you take a disk snapshot of a GCE image, you get a copy of varlib docker. So Docker Explorer is just Python that does some JSON parsing. So running the Docker Explorer on the mounted varlib docker and doing list running containers, you'll get container IDs that were running at that point in time the snapshot was taken. That you're then able to mount those file systems and see what was going on in the container, again, at that point in time when the snapshot was taken. So isolating one node and container is easy, but again, if you have hundreds of nodes, thousands of containers, how do you start analyzing what's going on in those quickly? Again, without having to log in. What do you do if your container has died? How do you get that information? There's a lot of container security vendors that have applications in this area, and they're here. I would encourage you to speak to them. But for this presentation, I really want to focus on some open source projects. So the first one is called GUR. It's an open source project from Google. It stands for GUR Rapid Response. It's an incident response framework for VMs. So the TLDR on this slide is secure it before you unleash it. So again, with GUR, you can remotely get detailed monitoring of your client or node CPUs, memory, I/O usage, and memory dump. So GUR has two main activities, flows and hunts. So a flow is when you've asked GUR to go find out something on one of your nodes. So maybe you want the memory on a running process. Maybe you want information about a certain file, like the contents of a file. That's when you would do a flow. A hunt is always running. It's looking for something bad. So maybe it's looking for a key file that's changed. Maybe it's looking for a malware signature or something like a jar file. And again, GUR is really focused on VMs. So one of the things it doesn't do is map Docker processes to OS PIDs. So this is where some of Sysdig's open source projects come in. So Sysdig kubectl capture records syscalls in a capture file, which can help you diagnose what was going on during an attack, even if the container has died. And then Sysdig inspect is an interface that displays the contents of the capture file. So the content is organized in these different tiles, each would show a value in relevant metrics and its trends. The tiles are organized in different categories to help surface information more clearly. You're able to then drill down into these different tiles and get the data behind it and really start investigating what was going on. You're also able to narrow your search based on a time window. And then similar to GUR, but for containers, you can get information on your CPU, memory, I/O, system calls, and even the contents of files. Cool.
So now that you've detected something, using your logs, using GUR, using snapshots, whatever happens to be, what should you actually do in your environment? So let's go through the most common mitigation options that you have at your disposal. You could send an alert, isolate a container, pause a container, restart a container, or kill a container. These options are increasing in order of certainty, but also in order of severity, right? Killing a container is your last possible mitigation, and even for the most severe of incidents, might not actually be the best option. As Anne explained, there isn't a great way of snapshotting containers, so live forensics is often your best bet. If you kill the container, you've lost that opportunity for analysis. So for each of these options, we're going to quickly go over what it is, when you'd use that option, and how you might do it. So first, alerting. Alerting notifies your security response team that something is going on in your infrastructure. It's about sending potential events to your security team for triage and further analysis. This is typically the first step before your team takes one of the more severe actions. If you're getting all of your logs in one place, like you should be, then your alerting should just leverage that. Use the same alerting tools that your ops team is already using, whether that's feeding alerts to email, Jira, Slack, PagerDuty, whatever works for you. Alerts should be based on specific metrics or on specific actions. So for example, CPU usage in your container or a new network connection. The hard part here is actually figuring out what you want to alert on. It's not commonly agreed upon what those metrics should be. It's going to end up being very specific on your particular infra. The next option is isolation. Now, I don't mean isolation in the sense of workload isolation, like running untrusted code in a multi-tenant cluster. I mean more like quarantine. You want to move the container to somewhere that you can examine it better without it necessarily knowing that anything is up, that you're actually looking at it. You probably want to do this when your container is doing something odd, but the workload that's affected isn't necessarily critical to your business. So this should help limit damage in your environment, for example, by preventing an attacker from moving laterally and getting access to further systems, or by preventing one application from DOSing another application. This is actually pretty hard to do well. Basically, what you need to do is move your container to a new network. So the easiest way to do this is actually to reschedule the workload on a new node. That's a preferred option than keeping the workload on the existing node and then removing all the other workloads. The reason being that in case those workloads are also affected, you're losing potentially important information. So when you reschedule your workload, to make sure that nothing else ends up on the same node, use kubecontrol cordon. And then you can create a restricted network policy to limit the container's connectivity. And then you can set up other tools that you want for investigation, like live forensics, on-node agents, or network filtering, and actually figure out what's going on. The next option is pausing a container. Pausing a container suspends all running processes in the container. This is a really good choice when you have a decent idea of what the issue is, and you just need to get some quick data for record keeping, or to confirm what it is, or determine what action to take next. This is particularly useful for conducting further forensics. One good example here is cryptocurrency mining. It's not necessarily harmful to your workload, but it could be costing you quite a bit of money. So by pausing your container, you're not incurring additional costs, but you also have the opportunity to take a backup and figure out the source of the issue before you actually restart the container. Pausing a container is actually pretty easy because it's built in. In Docker, you can use Docker pause to pause containers using the cgroups freezer. With the cgroups freezer, the process is unaware and unable to capture that it's being suspended and then subsequently resumed. So this is exactly doing what it says on the box, which is great. Restarting a container. Restarting a container kills and restarts a running container and resets the current state of the application. Restarting a container makes sense when you already have a fix that you're working on rolling out. So you have to be really careful with restarts. They don't make sense when you, they don't make sense unless you already know where the issue is coming from. So say an attacker has compromised your container, and if you restart it, you're kicking them off of that foothold, again, unless they've also compromised your node or something like that. But you're not actually fixing the problem, because they can get right back onto your container the same way they got there in the first place. In fact, you might have just made it worse, because now you told them that you know that they're there. Right? And you probably have multiple instances of the same container running in multiple places. They can get into all of those as well. So you're not actually fixing the problem, you're just kind of temporarily telling them, come at me harder. Like, it's not going to help you. So you can restart a container with docker restart. Using this command, you can also specify the seconds to wait for processes to stop before the container is actually killed and restarted. In Kubernetes, you can also delete the pod, and it'll just get rescheduled. I want to repeat this, though. You're supposed to do this when you already have a fix. So if you already have a fix, the easiest way to do this is to roll out your fix. You don't actually have to kill the container and do all this other stuff. Just roll out a new fix, kill the old workload, and magic. Your attacker is no longer in that workload. Lastly, killing a container. This is the last resort that you have, as it halts all running processes in the container. Like a restart, this will let the attacker know that you know, and doesn't fix the underlying problem. Plus, it takes your workload offline. Now, you might do this in a worst-case scenario. For example, you have an application that's actively exfiltrating sensitive user data. In this case, stopping the leak might actually be more important to you in your organization than figuring out how it happened or getting forensics. Again, very specific on your situation. To kill a container, you can use docker stop or cry control stop and docker kill. Docker stop stops the container by sending a sig term signal to the root process, asks nicely, and gives it 10 seconds to stop before sending, and if the process hasn't exited in that time period, it then sends a sig kill signal. Docker kill is less graceful. It doesn't wait around, it doesn't mess around, it just sends the sig kill signal directly. If you're at this point where you're killing a container, you probably want docker kill. You're not going to give it an extra 10 seconds to wait around. You can also remove a container forcefully with docker rm-f or cry control rm-f. The docker remove is for an already stopped container. Using the -f flag forces it to terminate using a sig kill signal first.
Awesome. All right, let's apply all this knowledge to a real-world scenario. So let's look at a common container attack, privilege escalation or container escape. So privilege escalation attacks allows containers to break out of their isolated context and essentially become root on the server and effectively having access to all the other containers running on that node. So maybe you've been contacted by your cloud provider and been notified that they've noticed some suspicious network traffic coming from one of your nodes or multiple nodes, or maybe you've seen a spike in CPU usage on your monitoring system. Neither one of these events actually indicates a security incident, let alone privilege escalation, but what they do give you is some information. They give you the nodes or set of nodes that the event might be happening on in a time range, date and time. So what do you have in place? Well, since you've listened to our presentation, you know that all your logs should be going to a central location. You know how to isolate and quarantine your disk snapshot. And then you've invested some time in container security specific tools. So let's first look at logs. So since you have that time range and host, start focusing on the logs there. Maybe you see something suspicious there, and you can take that pattern and search across other logs and to see if other nodes or hosts have been affected. So maybe you've narrowed this down to a set of nodes or a node. So let's start looking at the OS logs or deployment logs for that particular node. So you want to maybe start looking at where your container's launched in such a way that they shouldn't be. Maybe they're being ran as root or -- privilege or mounting file systems as they shouldn't. These could indicate privilege escalation. So maybe you've narrowed it down now at this point to a specific container that's still running. So you should have a pretty good idea of what your container images, the processes that are running in those. So looking at the container logs, are there some suspicious processes that are running? Maybe the wget or a curl that's downloading malware. Maybe something's been untard or some shell script that's running. Note those file names, because using your other, something like GR or the Sysdig products, you can get the contents of those files. And then, with network logs, are you seeing increased unexpected outbound traffic from your nodes? This could indicate that your data is being sent out places it shouldn't be. So you have a point-in-time snapshot of what was going on, potentially during an attack. In the case of privilege escalation, the malware within can get access to the underlying OS, possibly changing files on the OS. So you have this disk snapshot, but what you also have is the VM image that you create your nodes from. So you could effectively do a diff of these file systems and look for binaries that have changed. So things in like user bin that shouldn't have changed. Or in the case of the run C vulnerability that was announced in February, the malware might have changed a run C binary. So you would be able to detect that. And if that's the case, more than likely the privilege escalation has happened. So similar to what you might find in your container logs, you could find in the capture files, but with more information and correlation of things that are going on. So you can find information about what user was running the process, files the process was touching, I/O, unusual system calls, and then again the contents of a file. And then again, you're able to correlate events that you might not be able to correlate with your log files. And again, in the case of the run C binary getting overwritten, you might actually be able to detect the event that caused that to happen. So going back to the mitigation options that Maya talked about in the last section, the ones that we want to focus on for privilege escalation are alert and isolate. So in the case of privilege escalation, you could possibly get alerted, again, if your containers are being run as root or -- privilege. You can also get alerted on specific CVEs. So after identifying the container and node that have been affected, you want to quarantine these. If there really was a container escape, you may need to remove all the nodes that your container had touched, which possibly means creating a new node pool and migrating the clean pods over. And then once you've identified a fix for that container image, you'll want to roll out a fix or update to the new node pool. And then just last week, Sysdig released a blog post on how you could automate alerting and isolating with Falco, GCP, PubSub, and Cloud Functions, and we'll have a link to that at the end of this presentation. So what can you do today? So first, create that incident response plan. I mean, again, when an incident happens, you need to know the steps to take so we're not all in panic mode. Secondly, follow container security best practices when you're creating your clusters. Have all your logs syncing to a central location. And invest in container security specific tools, open source or not. And again, I encourage you to speak to some of the vendors that are here. And then rehearse the process with a fake event. You don't want to be the first time you run through this when an incident happens. You want to rehearse this so you can find where all the pointy edges are and fix them. And don't panic. You've got this. So here are some resources of some of the things that we mentioned throughout the presentation. I think these slides are also available. Yeah, online. Cool. So, Maya can take questions. No, I can take questions.
So just before we start the question and answer, reminder to fill out the SCED review of this talk. So that said, anybody questions?
I don't know how much time we have.
We've got about 5 minutes. Cool.
Yeah, great presentation. I'm strictly relating to the third mitigation option, the pause. Is there such an option in Kubernetes to pause a pod or to take it out from the service? Because I can do it with Docker, but I want to introspect it, I want to look at it, but I don't want my pod to keep having incoming requests.
Yeah, not that I know of. So I think you need to go to the runtime to actually pause the container.
OK, thank you.
Questions?
Hi. Are there any resources out there for what I'm looking for in my infrastructure logs or GKE logs so that I can identify possible incidents?
There's a couple of like open source references and things like that. So Falco has a bunch of open source rules for GKE specifically. On GCP, we also announced a product to beta a few months ago called Event Threat Detection, which looks specifically at logs for things that look bad. It's not container specific, it's for general issues. But there's a bunch of also partner solutions in this space. I think if you're asking though, like, is there a generic enough set of like rules in open source for things that look bad in Kubernetes clusters? Not that I have seen. Maybe you should create one.
So I actually have a question. What happens if your monitoring or logging infrastructure is running on a containerized, it's a containerized workload. So like, can you still trust the logs that are coming out of it?
Yeah, no, not really. So if you manage to compromise a node and you manage to compromise the daemon set on that node, you can't really trust anything that it's writing. So the way that I typically see security people do this is, I mean, assuming the daemon set will be OK. Well, let's take a step back. Two things that can be I'm sorry. I'm really trying hard. Two things that can be Two things that can be compromised. You can either compromise a daemon set that's running on the node itself. In that case, you've compromised the node, and you have bigger problems than just the container being compromised, because now your attackers at the node level. Either they escape the container, which is highly unlikely in the wild, but something that is worth investigating, or they have some other type of access on your node, and that therefore they're in other parts of your infra. The second thing they can try to compromise is where your logs get written to. So remember, we have a logging agent, and then it gets written to a logging infrastructure. So protect the logging agent by, typically a daemon set, again, at the node level. The logging infrastructure, what I typically see people do is actually write the logs to a separate project. The idea being if an attacker has gotten into a single project, they can probably access those logs. Even if they can't modify them, they can at least see them, which tells them that they know that you know. So having them written to a separate infra makes a lot of sense in that case.
And we've got time for like maybe one more. Cricket. Cool.
Thank you for the great talk. Like a real example, like a latest or recent incident you have worked on, just a quick sharing.
I can't really talk about incidents. We do a lot of vulnerability response. I think it's actually worth noting also, vulnerability response and incident response are different things, right? Until the vulnerability is exploited, you probably want a different team working on that than the incident response, because vulnerability response is something you can do, you can plan for, whereas incident response is very reactive. In terms of incident response, what I'll just basically say is the stuff that we see is what you would expect us to see. Like, please put passwords in Jenkins, patch your WordPress, please. I'll feel better.
Awesome. So any follow-ups that you have for Maya or Anne, please ask outside to give the other presenters time to set up. Thank you.